Welcome to the Mystic-Skeptic radio show and podcast, the program in which we ask the tough questions and explore different alternatives to today's pressing issues, theories, or enigmas. Our show is devoted to the exploration of all things mystical, philosophical, scientific, political, conspiratorial, and cosmic. Join us in an exploration of the Mystic-Skeptic mind space. In this week's show, we have our guest that we've been keeping up with Middle East Tonight for the last, year and a half you've been doing it?
About that, yeah.
Zachary Foster, and he's going to discuss this very relevant topic, how both Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar have been kind of railroaded by some of the people who are either supporting Israel or working with the Israeli, publicity people to try to discredit them. And I've been doing some research about that. So I know that you've been doing a lot of very poignant shows in the last couple of months. Can you give us an update of what's been going on your show before we delve into the topic?
Absolutely. So in the past few months over at Middle East Tonight, we've been producing a lot of content around the deal of the century. That's been a focus of the channel. The so-called deal of the century. I think the Trump administration is calling it the Peace to Prosperity Plan, and they've even updated the name since then. But basically, the Trump administration's plans for peace in the Middle East, that has been a major focus. We've also covered a wide range of topics. We did an episode in Egypt. We covered the Egyptian stand-up comedy scene. I actually did stand-up comedy in Arabic in that episode, so go check that out. We did a couple travel vlogs in Turkey, in Istanbul, and Bursa. We've done stuff on Jordan. We've done stuff on Saudi Arabia. So we try and cover a range of topics related to the Middle East. Actually, we also put out an episode on the Citizenship Amendment Act protests in India. They passed this new citizenship law in India that's explicitly discriminating against Muslims, and there have been mass protests in that country over the past few months against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And so we went to some protests, met some people, traveled around a bit, and learned about what's going on there.
And you also did an episode in Arabic. I was very excited to see you show your skills, and maybe you can get a bigger audience now that you're also delving into using that language as a medium.
Yeah, I had the idea for that episode really was very much incidental. I had been watching this show called El Salit Al-Ikhbari, which is a satirical news program in Arabic on AJ Plus Arabic, and I just thought I wanted to make an episode about that YouTube channel, about that program, El Salit Al-Ikhbari. And just when I was writing the episode, I'm just like, the people that are going to be interested in this episode are Arabs. They're Arabic speakers. They're people who watch that show. So it just was obvious that I had to do the episode in Arabic, and I kind of had a panic attack. I was like, you gotta be fucking kidding me, dude. I have to do this episode in Arabic? This is going to be terrible. It's going to take, first of all, it's going to take a long ass time to write. And then it's just going to take an even longer time to shoot because I'm going to fumble. I'm going to screw up the Arabic. I'm going to mess stuff up. So I don't know. I think it turned out okay, but we'll see where it goes.
And I'm trying to get the view. There you go. I was wondering how the people were going to see the show on YouTube because we had different view screens, but now we're supposed to be. And I have some light shining on one side, so I hope that doesn't distract people. But so the point of today's show is that we got to come clean. Like we're coming from different perspectives. You contacted my mentor a while back, and you wanted a different opinion to be able to bounce off on your show, and I thought that was a big thing for you to do because you can tell when you watch someone's show what is their background or what is their point of contention or what they're trying to say. And I claim to be a volunteer reporter, so I've had people on the show that actually, I guess they don't come back because they don't like the questions that I ask. But I don't have a journalism background. I have a communications background. And I know that when you say something, there's repercussions. It's the way that people take it and what you're trying to say. And what they told us when we started the show on Radio Free Nashville is the only request was do not do conservative radio because the airwaves are taken over by those guys. So if we do something that is alternative to that, we will always have a home at Radio Free Nashville. So I've been very cautious to not talk about Israel or anything related to that, because I have some biases in relation to the country having the ability to exist. But I would be thrown under the bus, just like Bernie Sanders, when you start saying that it's okay for other people to have human rights. It's okay for other people to find creative ways to resist things that they don't like. Somehow that has been taken completely out of the conversation. But I do follow some of the groups that are supposedly fighting anti-Semitism. So I would call them anti-Semitism. And there's people who are very well intended, but then they go overboard. So they post a lot from this group called the Canary Mission. And what they do is they have like a list. I'm glad you're not in it just yet, but they have a list of all these traders and professors and celebrities who are pro BDS or pro Palestinian, I don't know, you would call it resistance. And then they actually document the stuff. And sometimes you would actually be taken aback by the stuff that some people have said or the people that kind of support. So that's why, for me, you have to stay a little objective, because if you jump on one bandwagon, then you're taking all the heat, no matter which side it is. So the same mentor that you requested to participate in your show, he sent me something about Bernie Sanders, that Bernie Sanders decided not to go to the AIPAC conference. I'm like, why is he going to go? To get booed? And so going back to the Canary Mission group, I asked him specifically, as a reporter, why is it that Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders are not on your list? Because according to the conservative pro-Israel camp, they're the worst anti-Semites in the world. They actually had on their Jerusalem Post comparing one of the latest neo-Nazis to Ilhan Omar, and Ilhan Omar won the #1 prize according to this crazy survey that they had.
Yeah.
And to me, it was just a very biased, anti-Muslim style kind of thing. So if you want to ever have a conversation with the Muslim community or with the Palestinian community or with people that support their plight, you're never going to be able to achieve that if you're demonizing the other side. And then you get mad when they demonize you. So we have to be fair if we are ever going to be able to move forward. So when I contacted you regarding this issue, you mentioned how you wanted to talk about how the Israel lobby was trying to silence Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders. So let's just start from the beginning. In the last year, what have you seen in when it comes down to attacking these two senators? And what I noticed, the reason that Canary Mission does not have them listed is because they're smart enough not to go after senators, because then it seems biased and it seems hateful of sitting members of Congress. So I know it's a very complicated subject, but let's see what you have to say.
Yeah, well, let's just say, for starters, that organizations like AIPAC were traditionally bipartisan in their support. They had tremendous support on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, and that was more or less the case until very, very recently. Only in the past few years did Israel support for or not become a partisan issue in the U.S. And we can talk about why in a little while. But I think it's fair to say that up until very recently, it was a bipartisan issue. Even people like Bernie Sanders, I mean, we're not known for being outspoken critics of Israel 5-10 years ago. I mean, so the entire political atmosphere in the U.S. has dramatically changed in the past few years, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I would say number one is just generally the greater representation of women and minorities in the U.S. Congress, both houses. We saw that most dramatically in the past election, but I think that's already, you can see the four women who are, the crew, as they call them, all of them are very much critics of Israel. And I mean, I think even just taking a step back here of like, why is this becoming such a hotly contested issue? Why is it that people are saying like Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar are worse than neo-Nazis? Or I can't recall exactly what that poll was, but basically comparing them to neo-Nazis. Even I think the headline from yesterday was Chris Matthews said something. I don't watch Chris Matthews. Who's watching Chris Matthews these days? How's that guy still in the air? But he was comparing like Bernie Sanders' win in Nevada to some kind of comparison to the Nazis again, and it's just like, are you kidding me? So it's like, I think one of the reasons why there's just such vitriolic hatred towards these candidates, towards politicians critical of Israel, is that again, this was very recent. There's been tremendous bipartisan support for decades, really, and if you really think about the U.S. support being so critical to Israel, I mean, I think this is partially why it's become so vitriolic as well, because without the U.S. support for Israel, Israel would be in tremendous diplomatic trouble on multiple levels. At the UN, the U.S. acts as a veto in the Security Council. Just in terms of global military might, there's no comparison. The U.S. is by far the strongest military power in the world. Also, even regionally, within the Middle East, the U.S. is perhaps the single, maybe biggest power in the region. Perhaps now Iran is a more important player in the region. And that's also, by the way, I think why Israel is so hostile to Iran and why they've been so critical of the Iran deal is because really it's the U.S. and Iran, U.S. and Saudi Arabia on one side and Iran on the other, kind of battling for regional power. But basically the U.S. is the key player globally. And so without the U.S.'s support, what does Israel have left? And so I think you have, especially for that reason, you have all these voices in the U.S. seeing like, oh my God, like the tides are turning. The U.S. is Israel is no longer a bipartisan issue. Like, oh my God, like what does this mean for Israel? And yeah, that's exactly right. Without U.S. support, imagine if you had a world where the United States is pressuring Israel to withdraw from the settlements. We're going to cut off your $3 billion a year in military aid unless you make concrete steps to lift the siege on Gaza. We're going to cut off support for Palestinian refugees. In fact, the Trump administration already did that. But basically, the Trump administration cut support to the Palestinians. But what if the Trump administration said, hey, we're going to cut support to Israel as well? That would be a tremendous loss for Israel. And so, I think part of the reason why it's become so vitriolic is that this issue went from being a no-brainer, all politicians are basically supporting Israel to some extent or another, to becoming an issue where the mainstream progressive voice in the U.S. is very critical of Israel. So, I think that's partly why things have gotten so vitriolic.
Well, let's talk about that because there's a guy that I follow here in Houston, and he's from Egypt, and he says that compared to the true leftists of Europe and the Middle East, Bernie Sanders is a centrist because he's cautious on what he says. He says things very carefully. Well, he was doing that up until now. Now he's actually come out and said what has been in a lot of people's minds, that some of the ideas behind this so-called peace plan come from like an ethnocentric perspective. And to be honest, like everybody has like an ethnocentric perspective to a certain point. When Trump was saying, we worry about America first, that's what a lot of people think, and he was just voicing that. But you don't have to be a jerk about it. So when you put an Orthodox Jew in charge of the peace plan, it's going to be pro-Israel, and then you want to shove it down people's throats. But what was weird is that actually in all the lists they've been posting on Facebook, actually Saudi Arabia and some of the other countries who are in cahoots with the U.S. are actually cool with it. So it goes back to my theory that the Palestinian people are used as pawns by other powers to try to exert their own power and to manipulate the power dynamics in the Middle East, and that's the worst sin that is happening over there.
Yeah, well, there's certainly no question that the Palestinians are the pawns in all of this. I mean, you can start with the agreement itself, which was drafted between the U.S. and Israel. I mean, there were Israeli administration officials, Netanyahu government officials, who were closely involved in the drafting of this agreement. And on the U.S. side, as you pointed out, Jared Kushner was leading the U.S.'s team, which consisted of, by the way, not just Jared Kushner, who himself is an ultra-Orthodox, a modern Orthodox Jew, who's modern Orthodox Jews tend to believe that the entire West Bank is part of biblical Israel, and that 1967 was when Israel conquered the West Bank, was in partial fulfillment of the biblical prophecy of returning to the land. Of course, the land being Hebron, Jerusalem. That 67 fulfilled the biblical promise that we would be exiled and return. Which is Deuteronomy 28, I believe. So, that was Jared Kushner. And then Jason Greenblatt is another, I believe, I don't know where on the spectrum he is, but he's also a Jewish lawyer who was previously Trump's, I think that's not, okay. And then you have David Friedman, who's also an Orthodox Jew, who's the ambassador to Israel. Those three guys were in charge of drafting this peace plan. And David Friedman is a longtime donor to an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. He's a staunch supporter of the Israeli settlement enterprise. In fact, Trump himself, who's kind of the spearheading this whole initiative, himself actually has donated to Israeli settlements via, Jared Kushner and David Friedman, his ex-bankruptcy lawyer. So I think when you look at, the U.S., how this plan came into existence and the U.S.'s role in this plan and who is crafting the plan, it's pretty obvious that the Palestinians weren't. It's not that they weren't pawns; they just were non-existent at all. I mean, it's as if they didn't exist. This plan isn't really for the Palestinians. It's not about the Palestinians. It's a plan between the U.S. and Israel, basically, in which the U.S. acknowledges Israeli sovereignty over the existing settlement blocks in the Jordan Valley in exchange for Israel promising to halt settlement construction for 4 years, which Israel doesn't even have to consult because Israel doesn't even have to halt settlement construction because they would only have to do that in the event that the Palestinians actually agree to this plan. So the entire U.S. administration's approach involves partnering with Israel and basically completely ignoring the Palestinians. And in fact, as you kind of said correctly, the Palestinians are not just a pawn vis-a-vis Israel and the U.S., but also vis-a-vis the other Arab countries. The U.S. actually did get tacit support of this plan from Oman, the UAE, and I think Qatar. Don't quote me on that last one. But the U.S. got support from a number of Arab countries, and not just them, but they also got sort of lukewarm support from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, who both kind of came out and said this plan should be used as a starting point for peace negotiations. So I think the Palestinians are very much feeling like isolated completely, not just between, by Israel, by the U.S., but also the broader Arab world as well.
And before people attack us and try to shut down my show, either on YouTube or on the radio station, I just want to express that I've done research on this just like you have, and we come from different standpoints. But the ultimate thing is that this is affecting American politics. So there are things that when I get frustrated with progressives because they won't tell you the whole story. They say, well, Israel is getting millions of dollars from U.S. taxpayers. It's like, yeah, but that was agreed upon in the 80s when they were having the accords in Camp David, and a bunch of money is going to Egypt as well. So when you say that Egypt and Saudi Arabia are in cahoots with the U.S. about this, it's because it's an economic thing that they're going to keep on getting money from the U.S. or weapons or whatever. So people need to know that this is not about bashing Israel. This is not about trying to attack what people believe to be the homeland of the Jewish people or the Palestinians. What we're trying to say is, how can people go against a Jewish candidate for president and call him, who's Jewish and who's actually living up to the socialist values of a lot of Jews who founded Israel and who also live in the U.S., calling him anti-Semitic is misnomer. It's like ridiculous. You can make the false accusation of him being self-hating, but so far he has never attacked other Jews or said that Judaism is pointless or anything like that. All that he's doing is he's being consistent with his own socialist perspective that comes from a democratic standpoint, and we try to be consistent with our understanding of human rights or of politics where they're supposed to be fair. If you want to play dirty games and you want to push propaganda or other things, that's what both sides I see are doing. And up until not long ago, and I guess this is what's going on with Chris Matthews, is that if anybody ever thinks outside of the box or disagrees with the narrative that everybody has, they attack you as being a traitor, a communist, a Nazi. And this is what they're doing with Ilhan Omar and AOC and people like that. But they're not even willing to hear what they're trying to say. You might not agree with their tactics. You might think that their approach is too radical, but don't try to destroy the person and their reputation to push something that it is so clearly biased. So the reason that I see Bernie building up a lot of support is because young people, and I guess they're saying that Bernie Sanders cannot win only with young people's support, that he needs older people to be involved. Well, you and I are no spring chickens, and we can see through all the manipulation. Why is it that most people are so easily swayed one way or another, in your opinion?
So easily swayed one way or another on which specific issue?
Well, it's like either you support Israel and you are non-anti-Semitic and a good person, or you're messed up on the other side, and then they demonize each other. So there's a purity test. If you don't support BDS, you hate the Palestinians, and on the other side, if you don't support Israel, you hate all Jewish people. You're an anti-Semite. Like, why can't we have this disagreements on how we're gonna get through this without being so hateful?
Yeah. Well, I would say one of the most popular critiques among pro-Israel folks of the left is that they single out Israel. That it's like they have 180 countries in the world they could have criticized, and there's all these horrible offenders in the world. Like, go to North Korea, go to South Sudan, go to Bangladesh, go to wherever else, and you're going to find all these horrible atrocities and all these people being oppressed and all these human rights violations. And why are you singling out Israel? Bangladesh and South Sudan were probably bad examples. Those countries aren't that bad. But that is, I feel like, what drives a lot of this pro-Israel disgust and kind of accusations of anti-Semitism, is this belief that Israel, of all the countries in the world, is sort of unfairly singled out. And I think that's actually worth addressing that criticism, because I think a lot of people on the left just dismiss it. But I actually think it's worth talking about why Israel is such a focus, not just in the US, but internationally. Why is it that, I remember when I was living in Syria, in Damascus, it was like the front page headline was some Israeli vice president got kicked off some commission on European interagency environmental affairs. That was the front page. It was just some obscure administrative bureaucratic decision of an Israeli official getting removed from some council, and it was a front page headline. Why was that the case in Syria in 2008, 2009? Why is it that when you open the US headlines, Israel is constantly in the headlines? Certain Israel-Palestine is constantly making news, even if it's relatively a settler got stabbed by a Palestinian, or for example, this Palestinian who was dragged by an Israeli tank. I haven't followed that story super closely. It's just last day or two. But this is now, and that flared up, and there's rocket attacks from Gaza, and Israelis are responding with their own strikes, and this is big news in the U.S. This is making headlines. So there's flare-ups in Israel and Palestine, and that's making headlines in the U.S. And yet there are all these other major international issues that don't get as much attention. And I definitely think there's something to that. The same is true in the U.S. Congress. UN resolutions. There are more UN resolutions on Israel-Palestine, of course, being critical of Israel, almost all of them, than many other countries. Of course, countries that play a much bigger role in international affairs. So the question is, why is Israel such an obsession of the international community? I think this is the same question that needs to be asked, really. I think actually that's the more interesting and more important question to ask. And it doesn't. And I think this belief among pro-Israel people that Israel is unfairly targeted is kind of, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, why is Israel just being talked about the most? And of course, if you're being talked about the most, and then of course you're occupying the West Bank, and then you're having a siege on Gaza, and you're killing Palestinian children, you're detaining thousands of Palestinian children. So you're going to be criticized then, obviously, if you're the one in the news. And so I think there are a lot of reasons why Israel is in the news. We could talk about them. I mean, that's a very interesting conversation to have. But it's just worth noting that, like, by the way, the first thing I would say, if I had to just give like a one-line response to this question, it would be like, Israel-Palestine, people have obsessed over Israel-Palestine in the West especially, and I think that's really what we're talking about here. No one's of the belief that Israel has headlines in China and Japan every day. It's primarily Western Europe and the US and other, Canada and basically, Western powers. But basically, these places in the US and Europe, people have been obsessed, and I include Russia, by the way, in this orbit, all of Eastern Europe and Russia. People have been obsessed with Israel for centuries. There's nothing new about this obsession. It dates back, of course, to Jesus Christ himself, who was from Palestine. And there have been travelers in the West from Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well, and the Russian Empire to Palestine on pilgrimage for centuries. More people traveling to Palestine, perhaps maybe with a couple other places high on that list as well, but Palestine is very much at the top of that list. The most popular book sold in the United States in the 1850s was a book about a travel guide to Palestine. By the way, save for the Bible, which is of course about Palestine as well. So, if you look at like geography textbooks from like the 19th century, this is part of my dissertation research, but like there'll be like 50% of the book will be like the world, and then the other 50% will be like Palestine, because like that's where Jesus was from. So that's what matters. In fact, there'll be like entire sections just on Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and Nazareth. So there's been this obsession with the Holy Land for centuries, and I think the modern manifestation of that obsession is this criticism that you see being expressed across the world towards Israel. I think specifically with regard to some other things like UN resolutions, the obsession has to do with the fact that there are 21 Arab countries or 22 Arab countries, and they control the price of oil through OPEC. So the rest of the world, dependent on fossil fuels, is going to vote whichever way the Arabs want them to vote because they need fossil fuels. So I just think that's like a sort of a economic issue, really, primarily, and doesn't really have anything to do with Israel per se. So kind of a coincidence, I would almost say, but having to do primarily with the Arab voting power in the UN and generally just their ability to control the price of oil through OPEC. And so I think when you start to like add up these issues, and then of course the Jewish diaspora is large. I mean, you have Jews, you have a huge Jewish population in the US, you have Jews across Western Europe. The Palestinians don't quite have that same size of a diaspora. So, they're just, for that reason as well, kind of more spread out and more able to like influence affairs across the country. And of course, Jews by and large being like generally pro-Israel. Of course, that's changing in the US, by the way, but still, even so, the mainstream Jewish opinion is very much pro-Israel. So I think you have a conflation of reasons, but I think the belief that the anti-Semitism in the US is somehow that there's just like, there has always been and always will be anti-Semitism of like the 19th century European kind of like big noses and money grubbing Jews and taking over the world. And so that image of anti-Semitism that has always been and always will be is just a complete fiction. It dates to like I was saying, like that vision of anti-Semitism, it like has a specific historical trajectory and was popular in parts of Europe. But like the belief that that always will be the case, and that that's what's driving the criticism of Israel in Western Europe and the US, I think is honestly kind of nonsense.
Well, wait until Bernie becomes the nominee from the Democrats, and all that stuff is going to come to the surface. Someone that I listened to on KPFT here in Houston was saying that the biggest challenge is not the socialist aspect of him, it's him being Jewish. And it's weird because when I lived at the farm in Tennessee, some of the Jewish folks there said that whenever they came to, it was mostly like Church of Christ Christians in Summertown, that they were like celebrities to them because they were Jewish. That some Christians actually are happy to meet a Jew because they feel like they're connecting with the Bible or with God. But that's like a very small percentage of the population. When they see a Jew trying to be president, it's going to be like when Kennedy tried to be president, and they were like, why would a Catholic who's in league with the Vatican try to, be the king of the world per se? But they're okay with Donald Trump being the king of the world. And I think that it's going to flip on everybody. Like, just like I was surprised that Obama was elected the first time, because I thought that the racism in America was so great that he wouldn't be able to overcome that, especially as they were doing, just like they're doing with Bernie, calling him all different things to try to dissuade people against him. They were saying, people say he's a Muslim, and I would be like, and it's like, no, he's a radical, and he supports bad people, and he's trying to take down the country and destroy our values and stuff like that. And all that actually backfired, and it made him more sympathetic. Do you think that it's possible that the same thing would happen with Bernie this time around?
It's a really good question. I honestly don't know. I mean, I am curious to know more about the anti-Semitism that Bernie has faced. I haven't, it may very well be I'm not following this story close enough, but have there been anti-Semitic attacks on Bernie specifically for being Jewish?
There haven't, and that's what is surprising. But what people don't understand, and even in Mexico where I'm from, people have a hard time even differentiating between Arabs and Jews. Some people are so anti-Semitic per se, in the true meaning of the word, that they will like anybody from the Middle East is an Arab or is someone not to be trusted. So I find it that a lot of that comes that is connected. So when they go after Ilhan Omar or Representative Rashida Tlaib, and now Bernie, they're trying to equate all these outsiders, all these others, and they're bringing these non-American values to the table. But what people don't understand is that, again, you're bringing more sympathy to them because we haven't had a chance to give an Ethiopian refugee the opportunity to be in Congress, or a Palestinian American. So now there's actually 3 Jews in the run for Democratic presidential nominee. That's actually a great achievement. And I know that people there was a guy, he's very popular among conservatives, who was complaining years ago that there was too many Jews in the Supreme Court. So I'm sure that they're going to start saying that. It's like, why is there 3 Jews out of 8 candidates running for president? They're going to start making these associations, and then it starts getting connected. It's like, well, the liberal Jews support blacks, and they support refugees, and support Middle Easterns, and they're trying to take away our values and change the country. And what I saw is, as Trump got elected, because there was this fear that the country was getting away from the good old Americans. What has been your experience when you talk to people about the Middle East and you bring this progressive perspective? Have you had the type of support that the people encourage you to keep doing that, so even the left can be informed about what's going on in the Middle East? Because a lot of times you feel that people only know bits and pieces, and they kind of only give you these flashcard points about, well, you have to support the refugees and you have to fight for the people of Syria. But I don't see people being that well knowledgeable about what's happening in the Middle East to be able to make a case and support it proficiently, from what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, just on your earlier point, I think, this question of, is Bernie going to face if he is the nominee, which I think is still pretty early, but like, you know, if he is the nominee, what opposition will he face? I think all of the leading candidates are gonna. I mean, I think the from my point of view, like the question really ought to be like, what's the difference between the opposition that Bernie would face versus Warren versus Buttigieg versus Biden versus Bloomberg or Klobuchar? What is going to be the thing that would lead that candidate to lose, right? And I think for each of those candidates, you know, it's going to be something very, very different. And I think that the other question is like, which of those is most threatening? Yeah, in the case of Bernie, he's a socialist. I mean, I think the socialism is more dangerous than his Judaism. I mean, yes, there are anti-Semites in the U.S. Yes, there is a neo-Nazi movement. Yes, they exist. Yes, it's pretty scary. Yes, it's on the rise. Yes, Trump has flamed this fire. But I think the number of people in this country who are hostile to socialism, which they perceive as just a kind of a slightly blander version of communism, is far greater than the number of people who identify with or are sympathetic to these neo-Nazi movements. So I would see that as a much bigger threat to Bernie as I would like the Jewish question. I mean, remember when Joseph Lieberman was the vice presidential candidate of Al Gore back in I think it was 2000. And Joe Lieberman was not just Jewish, but like an Orthodox Jew, a practicing Orthodox Jew who went to shul on Saturdays. I don't recall there being much anti-Semitic. I mean, granted, he was the vice presidential candidate, but I don't know. I'm not seeing that being a big issue for Bernie, especially because, you know, he's not out. You know, he actually tries to hide his Judaism. I mean, not that really matters for these people, people who believe in kind of like, you know, Jews are like a genetic group, but, you know, he doesn't talk about it openly. I bet a lot of people don't even, I mean, maybe just the way he talks with that like strong, like Yiddish New Yorker accent. So maybe that's kind of a giveaway for people, even if they didn't know. He kind of wears his Judaism, like even just the way he pronounces literally every single word. But anyways, talking about some of the other candidates, I mean, honestly, I think like if you look at the especially like with someone like Warren or Klobuchar, even though these are very like, especially Warren politically is so aligned with Bernie. I mean, the differences between them are so trivial. Honestly, the policy differences are so minor. I mean, you look at the grand scheme of things. How much patriarchy and paternalism and gender discrimination do we still have in this country? And how many men do we believe are there that in the U.S. who basically subconsciously or consciously wouldn't vote for a female presidential candidate? It's horrifying to not vote for a candidate for that reason. But is that something that people are thinking? I mean, yeah, that's how we see a huge issue there. We still live in this country where gender discrimination is widespread. And where men are still oftentimes of the belief that a female is not as capable as a man, a woman is not as capable of a man as doing a job like a president. That's still a widespread belief in this country. I mean, we have half of this country believes Donald Trump should be president. That should give you an indication of enough of just how backwards of a country we live in when it comes. You know, I think all the candidates have major. There's a potential for these kinds of opposition movements to exist for any of the candidates, but I think Bernie of anyone really is honestly the most hopeful. And one final point I would mention is that there was a recent piece in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago about political forecasting. And the traditional view among political forecasters was that you had to understand the swing vote, that if you understood which way the swing voters are going to vote, that is the key to understanding the election. And most political forecasters, again, according to this piece in The Atlantic a few weeks ago, actually adopted that point of view. And this new political forecaster in 2018, I forget her name, but she pointed out that actually in 2018, the more interesting, and she, by the way, she got like 98% of the districts right. So she basically called every district correctly, higher than almost any of the other, I think She was the highest among all the political forecasters. And what she looked at was not swing voters, but new voters. Voter turnout for her was the key issue, was that if you can explain which candidate is able to bring new voters out to the polls, like people who previously didn't vote or you couldn't rely on them to vote, whichever candidate could bring out the new voters, that's the candidate who won. And that's what Trump did in 2016, right? That's, he brought out all these people who weren't political, but they said, fuck the establishment, we want Trump. We identify with this person. So that's why Trump won. That's what explained 2018. And I don't have an answer as to who is going to bring out new voters. I don't know. But I think if you're looking to if all you care about is making sure we beat Trump in 2020, then what you should ask yourself is, which candidate can bring out the vote?
And that's what you think that the Democratic Party would be worried about. But Buttigieg, when he was a sore loser in Nevada, he was saying, you can't take down capitalism. It was either Buttigieg or Bloomberg. They were saying that Bernie's so radical that he's trying to tear down capitalism and put a socialism instead. So I want to talk about socialism as a movement in the Middle East, because in my research, you find out that people usually think that the war between Palestinian Arabs, who are mostly Muslim, and Jewish settlers, or whatever you want to call the people who founded the State of Israel, that is a religious war. This war has been going on for 3,000 years, and it's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard, because when you study the social movements of the 1930s, the sense of nationalism came, and then socialism or other form of political movements different from democratic, or maybe the democratic socialism or whatever they call it at that time, were the forces that were at odds with each other from different ethnic groups. So can you tell us a little bit about how, when people think about Israel now, they think of a capitalist, very Americanized style of government, but it's actually built on socialist construct. And then the Palestinian people were also trying to do that, and there was different powers that were threatened by socialism on that side of the world, but they were willing to tolerate some socialists, just like now they're willing to tolerate some communists, like the Chinese or Russia to a certain point. So can you tell us a little bit about the history, and can you have opposing socialisms from two different groups, and why is it that they weren't able to work together to create one nation?
Well, that's a really fascinating history of socialism and communism in the Holy Land. And as you pointed out, I mean, the Zionist settlers originally were, for the most part, socialists. I mean, at the very beginning stages in the 1880s, there were some kind of capitalist landowners who went, but basically the thrust of the Zionist movement for many, many decades was that it was a socialist movement. And I mean, and not just socialism, but like agricultural labor socialism. Like, we're going to actually farm the land and reap the fruits of our labor ourselves. And for a while, there actually were many attempts, Zionist socialists in the early period, say, from the early 20th century, even well into the 30s and 40s, I would say. There were many attempts by Zionist socialists to build bridges with Arab socialists and communists. By the way, there was a separate Palestinian Arab Communist Party in Palestine. I'm not sure exactly what your research is on, but you may know more about this than me. There are a couple of books here. Musa Budairi wrote a book in Arabic on the Palestinian Communist Party from 1920 to 1948. Zachary Lachman wrote a book on Jewish and Arab workers in the British Mandate period and a little bit before as well, I believe. So there were many attempts, and ultimately, a Jewish Palestinian Communist Party never really thrived, and I think that's primarily because you couldn't reconcile the nationalism with the socialism. They just didn't vibe, because the social Palestinian and Palestinian socialism and Zionism can work just fine in Argentina or the U.S. or Canada, but they can't work together in Israel Palestine. It's just impossible, because the Zionists want to build a Jewish state and the Palestinians want to build an Arab Palestinian state. So they're just totally incompatible, regardless of what you believe about labor and who should own the means of production. I mean, I think ultimately that's just too big a gap to bridge.
And what people don't understand is that that's when groups that are opportunistic walk in and say, well, we already divided all of the Arab land between different countries. Now we're going to divide Palestine, as it was called at that time, one Jewish side and one Arab side, just like they did in India, one Muslim side and one Hindu side, and look how it's working out now. And then everything's going to be fine and dandy. And then you get people involved in like, well, who are we going to sell weapons to? And there's I still don't know how any politician or any businessman can bet on war and think, okay, if we give weapons to both sides, or if we side with one side, it's going to work out at the end, because it can blow up in your face. And we've seen that with Afghanistan and building different guerrilla groups over there. So I just think that people need to be aware of all these inconsistencies. Like, nothing is monolithic, and there's been a lot of good and bad people on all sides. And now us in the US, is really easy to jump on one side and be like, well, I know that this group was always pure and they always had good intentions. I sent you that article where they talk about how when Israel was established, it was always this very pristine situation, and people like rewrite history to fit their narrative. And I've challenged people in the past that you never hear Palestinians criticize themselves, because what I know from Arab culture is that your honor is a very important thing. So it's good to be self-critical, but when you're talking in public, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't like air out all your dirty laundry, because then it undermines your case. And I think that's what AIPAC and all these groups demand from all Jews, that if you have issues with Israel, if you have concerns about what's going on over there, that maybe you should keep it in-house, and maybe we can debate about it over here, but don't go around telling the whole world that you have problems with that, because then you're a traitor. And I'm afraid that mentality that has been going on for a while now has taken a deep root in America, with this whole thing where you heard that Trump is now firing anybody who's not a loyalist. So that's a very scary thing. And when people say, well, I know that guy is not anti-Semitic because he has a Jewish daughter, ex-Jewish wife, he supports Israel and stuff like that. Like, yeah, he supports people who agree with him. Anybody who's outside of that is now worse than a Jew, is a traitor. And that's very scary stuff, because it sounds like what was going on in the 30s back in Europe, that anybody who stood against oppression was labeled as something. And that's, I don't know how people are not like shouting out from the streets that like we're not building a democracy as the way things are going. We're actually working against it. So do you think that the advances that happened in the last election, where we got representatives that are more progressive, do you think that can be pushed through, or are we losing any foothold in this democracy the way things are going?
No, I mean, I think the pendulum is going to swing back. I mean, I'm hopeful and optimistic, but I actually really do think that the number of people in this country who are so sick of Trump. I mean, we saw this already in the midterms, and we already know that Trump is how unpopular. We don't have to believe the polls. We saw it in the midterms. He's just as unpopular among those people who voted out Republicans in 2018 as he is today. If anything, it's even more absurd after the impeachment and after the Ukraine scandal, and just the day-to-day, just the number of scandals that come out literally on a daily basis. Trump University was deemed is basically stealing money from its students. Trump's charity foundation is spending tens of thousands of dollars on billboards of pictures of Donald Trump. I mean, these are footnotes. These are stories that people don't even know about. I mean, forgetting about all the foreign policy blunders, the deal of the century blunder, the assassination of Soleimani, the Iranian general that almost sparked a war with Iran. Now Trump's got, plans for a peace treaty, a peace plan in Afghanistan with the Taliban. We'll see where that goes. But just the number, the border issues with Mexico, children in cages. I mean, just the number of things that he's done. I mean, you could just literally list hundreds and hundreds of things that have inflamed the American public. I mean, he's tremendously unpopular. And we saw that in 2018. I think we'll see it again in 2020. I mean, I certainly hope so.
And for those that believe that you need a strong arm to get anything done, I remember watching Bill Maher back in the 2000s when he was saying, we need to go to war with Iraq because we're going to kick their butt and then they're all going to bow down, and we need to be dominant, and that's the only way that people understand. And then that's the same idea behind a lot of the Trump support, that, if you have a diplomatic president who's trying to make peace with the world, that they start losing respect, that he's just another Jimmy Carter, that we need a tough guy. We need someone who speaks his mind and who can push people around, and that's going to protect us. That's the law and order king that you need. And even to the point of, like, that's why you re-elect someone like Trump, because even though you might not like him, he's showing strength. What would you tell to people like that in a sense they're giving someone open reign because of these fears, instead of building relationships and collaboration between different countries? We're just going to upset everybody, and like that they'll fear us and they'll leave us alone.
Well, I think it's true that you do want your president to inspire confidence and decision-making ability. There's no question about that. And so that's why public speaking is such a critical thing that a president has to do well. No question about that. And Trump is obviously a compelling public speaker, and that's why people like to listen to him. And he does have that ability. Don't doubt his ability to rile up a crowd. I mean, by the way, that's very common among demagogues. That's what demagogues do. They can rile up a crowd. So there's no question he does have that appeal and that charisma among a lot of people. And that's why I do think it is. I mean, I do think Democrats have to be careful about who they choose, because you choose an uncharismatic person, and there's that risk. I agree.
And what about AOC and the squad? Do you think that they have gone too far? Like, I struggle because, when I used to be involved in unionism, they would do these protests, and you can complain and whine all you want, but it doesn't make a difference unless there is some legislation that comes with it. So when you have someone who's very outspoken like AOC, it could actually backfire, because it's a lot. I know she's passing good resolutions. I know she's challenging people, but when it's all about your personality and it's all about your ideas, then it's easy to tear down those ideas. Like, what about policy, platform, values? Like, I think that in a sense, what is being lost is the ability to fight over issues. Like, now we're fighting over personalities and personality cults. So you might not like a representative, but they are representing you. They're doing things that you support. So the fear that I have is that since Trump ran on this personality and this type of showman thing, that unless you have another showman or someone who can reveal the corruption of this one, then it's just it's a game. It's almost like a high school thing. It's like, who's the most popular versus who's actually fighting for the people.
I mean, yeah, there's no question that you know, policy, I think, is way more important than optics. Um, Policy is why you should choose the candidate you choose, not, you know, who can land a punchline. I mean, this isn't a comedy venue. You know, unfortunately, a lot of people think it is. I mean, I think part of the reason why Trump is able to rile up crowds is that he does understand some basic sense of like joke structure, and he can land a punchline. Unfortunately, that's not what qualifies you to be president. In fact, that probably makes you unqualified to be president, because you're not trying to tell jokes. You're trying to make, you know, so yeah, I think it's, you know, policy really is what matters, as you said. You know, unfortunately, we live in a country where people make decisions based on optics. It's tremendously tragic. I completely agree.
And what do you think about, you know, one of the main issues with Democrats right now is this incrementalism versus radical change. And, you know, if we start talking about revolution, people freak out because they think you're Che Guevara. But, you know, there's a way to bring about a revolution or a change. But most people are like, no, I'm just going to stick with the guy that's going to do it a little bit at a time. So
Yeah.
let's say that Bernie gets elected, but the Congress, even if they're Democratic, are not going with what he's proposing. How is there ever going to be a change if there's so much red tape and there's so much opposition from your own party that doesn't want to shake the boat too much or do anything that is too outrageous?
Well, I mean, we have a a division of powers for a reason in this country. I mean, we elect a president. The president is supposed to execute the decisions of you know, execute law that's passed by Congress, but the president is not a lawmaker. You know, we entrust Congress with that. So, of course, Bernie Sanders, if elected, would presumably present his plans for Medicaid for all and present his plans for other policy initiatives, but ultimately it's Congress that passes law, not the president. So so I think that's okay. You know, I think that's he'll have to compromise with Congress on a lot of issues, because clearly, you know, there'll be plenty of Democrats who aren't going to go along with his plans for you know, some of his more, say, radical plans like free college tuition for everybody, or erasing all student debt and some of the other ideas. So, you know, clearly he's going to have to compromise, but uh, I think that's okay. I think that's how our political system works, and I think it's probably for the better.
And do you have a realistic position or dream uh, for the Holy Land? Do you have um, anything that we can even fathom that would work with the situation? Because what people don't think about is that it's actually a very impossible situation, like you were saying with socialism. Like, you have two different narratives, two different peoples. As much as we can talk about you know, common values or religious heritage that we have from different holy books, or just being genetically connected somehow, or when people say we're not at all. What could happen in the next 100 years that is not a disastrous situation as it seems like it's coming between
Yeah.
Palestine and Israel? Because we can debate all day, but the realities that are happening, do you have any like good news or positive things that you've seen or collaborations between different people? Because a lot of times what the politicians say is one thing and what's happening on the ground is something else. But
Yeah.
now it seems like any idea that people come up with, becomes a reality because the people are so either ignorant, unmoved, or unable to actually exert any power. So
Yeah.
is that what's happening? They've taken the power away from the man on the street in both Palestine and Israel, and that's what's happening here as well.
Yeah, I think I would say my biggest hope, realistic hope, let's say, for the future of Israel Palestine is not in Israel; it's in Palestine. I think Israel is becoming more and more right wing, and in a time when Palestinians are becoming more and more nonviolent. I mean, we've never seen a time period in Palestinian history, I think, quite like this, where like you have mass nonviolent movements across the West Bank. Let's leave Gaza aside for a minute, but like, the BDS movement, nonviolent protests in, Bilin, Nilin, Nebi Saleh across the West Bank. I mean, this is, I think, really tremendous that we're seeing so much like nonviolent resistance in the West Bank. So at a time when Palestinians have abandoned violence, you see a rise in right-wing politics and basically the entire Israeli political system moving to the right. So just ask yourself how that's possible. So where is the change going to come from? Is it going to come from Israel? I don't think so. I think ultimately the change has to come actually from the Palestinians. And I know this is unfair to them, but that's just, life sucks sometimes, and they're really being burdened by this conflict the most here, both on be the ones being screwed over, living under occupation or siege on the one hand, but also the ones really basically who I'm saying are going to be needed to solve the problem as well. But ultimately, I think the Palestinians have to they have to get rid of the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority is, in my view, a massive obstacle to peace, because they're essentially subcontractors of the Israeli occupation. They enable Israel to maintain its control over the West Bank by maintaining law and order, maintaining a police force, collecting trash and delivering utilities. But basically, the PA is a subcontractor of Israel. And so I think ultimately, if you get rid of the PA, what's left is the raw, bare cruelty of military occupation. And at that point, I think Palestinians, there'll be massive uprising. I would hope peaceful, and that it would be mass peaceful, nonviolent resistance to Israeli occupation. I think only then will you start to see movement on the Israeli side of being like, Jesus Christ, guys, we're the bad guys. We can't be shooting at peaceful protesters. We need to change. That would cause, I think, a change in Israeli society, and then you'd have, I think, some movements towards peace. But as long as the Palestinian Authority is around, I have no hope.
What would you say to people that say that what's creating a more peaceful society in Palestine is having that strong arm and being very security oriented? Because the common idea is that the reason there hasn't been any violence in Israel is because they've closed most entrance from Palestine into Israel, and they have been very meticulous with security. And I'm sure that they're using NSA tactics and satellite to pinpoint people and stuff like that. So it has become almost like a police state for it to stay peaceful and not have major conflict. So what would you say to people like that, where they would question your perspective that it is actually a heartfelt, nonviolent process as compared to a forced one?
No, that's a great point. I mean, there are obviously perpetrators of violence among the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and I wouldn't deny for a moment that there aren't people who are trying to commit violence against citizens, Israeli citizens. Those people exist. They exist everywhere in the world. They're not unique to the West Bank. They exist in Israel, by the way, as well, among Israelis who attack Palestinians. But yeah, so there are always security risks, regardless. But of course, if you look at the mainstream, Palestinian movements today in the West Bank, they're nonviolent. They're nonviolent. They use nonviolent methods. NGO life in the West Bank is thriving. You have dozens, hundreds of nonprofit organizations doing, basically nonviolent work towards peace, towards justice in the West Bank. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the West Bank to oppose violent attacks on Israeli civilians, I think primarily what you're seeing is actually fear and not reality.
And do you have any criticisms of the BDS movement? Is there such a thing as too radical of perspectives within that movement that actually are counterproductive in the sense of like, you don't only have to agree that there is injustice going on right now, or there was injustice going on in 1967, or the settlement shouldn't be there. You have to agree, like the whole shebang, that they should have never even been there to begin with, that the UN should have never, or the League of Nations given them some land. Like, is there like different levels of commitment towards the BDS movement, or is it demanded that you agree with the whole platform that they have?
No, BDS comes in shades of gray. You've got people who are kind of BDS light, who say just boycott and divest from companies that do business with Israeli illegal settlements. And you've got the more hardcore radicals who say any engagement with any type of Israeli musician, they call for boycott of musicians to Israel. They call for boycotts of any type of foreign travel to the country itself, even. So that you have the radical. It's a spectrum.
And where do you fall in between, or you don't want to say?
I wish there was more a movement among Palestinians to oust the Palestinian Authority. I think if you boycott the Israeli settlements, but leave in place the Palestinian Authority, then great. You got rid of you harmed Israel's interests in the West Bank, but that's not the fundamental problem here. I think let me say that the very first thing you have to do is get rid of the PA, because there's no possible chance that the PA is capable of negotiating with Israel. Israel is just because it'd be like a little brother negotiating with a big brother. The bigger brother's stronger. You can't. It's just not going to work. I mean, we've tried this already for 20 years, basically 25 years. The PA has no negotiating power with Israel, so Israel just does whatever it wants. You have to disband this organization and really start over. I mean, it's kind of saying, okay, let's go back to 93 before the PA existed and say, this was a mistake. Let's try this again. So, I mean, where I fall in BDS, honestly, like it's a tough issue, and maybe for the next episode.
I just want to I wish there was some type of cultural event or some type of speeching engagement where people could give different perspectives. I feel now that if you go to a BDS meeting and you say, well, the only thing I want is to get rid of the PA, they would kick you out. And then if you go to a pro-Israel event and you say, you know what, I think that the Jews and Arabs should live on both sides of the fence, because it's the Holy Land, it's the land that God gave the world. They would kick you out too, because you're too hippy dippy, or you're too specific. Like, everybody wants you to again join that narrative and take the curses and the curses and the blessings that come with it. So all I can hope that this show and other shows like this one can do is open people's minds and know that there is a lot of, like you said, gray and in between and nuance with someone's approach, and not to assume that just because someone is favorable towards one group or another, or supports some elements of that narrative, that means that they're gone, or they're horrible people, or they are ideologues. I think that was the biggest insult that I heard towards Bernie, that he was an ideological madman or something like that. And it's like, the moment that you call someone an ideologue, then you're saying that in a sense they're a bigot, that they're not willing to work with anybody or change. Would you agree with that type of criticism coming from someone who's trying to knock you down?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to be reasonable. It's the number one rule of politics is be reasonable. So definitely.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you again for being on the show. We support what you're doing with just venturing into the Middle East. That's a big thing, because again, it's kind of like Latin America. Like, is so vast. There's so many things going on over there, and all we get is like little glimpses here in America. So I don't understand how this country gets so much attention and there's very little going on. Like even with all the people that live here, compared to stuff that's going on in other parts of the world, we are like a microcosm. And then now we're having like finally the voices of refugees and immigrants are being heard. And in this radio station, we have music from Africa, from other parts of the world being played. That's something that enriches someone's life. So thank you for enriching the lives of your viewers and for opening avenues for people in the Middle East to share their experiences.
Thanks for having me.
Take care, man.